Hi, this is Tony from BesideTheFrontDoor.com, and we're going to talk about rocks in the bottom of your containers. Now, do you need rocks in the bottom of your containers? No. Is it good sometimes? Yes. There's times to use them and times not to. Some really good times to use rocks in the bottom of your containers is if you need that extra weight at the bottom of the container so that wind or the dog's tail doesn't knock it over as they're going by. Another time that you need rocks is if it is actually a catch pot instead of a pot, meaning there is not a drainage hole in the bottom of that container letting the water out. You need to make sure the water is let out of the container. If there is no hole, put a good layer, 2-3 inches at least, of gravel at the bottom of that container and set a second pot in there that your plants are actually planted in. That way the excess water can drain down below that and your plants are held up above that excess water. If that drainage water builds up enough so that it gets up to the top level of that gravel, then you can simply pop out your plant that has the pot that has the plants in it, and then either dump out that water, siphon out that extra water, just to reset it. Now, the reason why many times you wouldn't want to use pots, use stones at the bottom of your planter. Sometimes when you would not want to use stones in the bottom of your container, or when you want to have as much water holding capacity in that container as possible, for it to last as long as possible between waterings. Think of your potting soil as a sponge. So a sponge can only hold so much water. Before you drip a little more water in, the sponge is completely saturated. It just goes out the bottom. There's just no extra holding capacity at all. So if you take that sponge and set it up on its side, you will notice that the bottom of the sponge, the side that's further down, is much more saturated, and the top is moist but not completely saturated. And that's the same thing that's going to happen with your potting soil. So the further up you bring the bottom of that sponge, the further up you bring that saturated section of soil, which the plants don't like, that saturated section. Think also if you cut 2 inches off the bottom of that sponge, that just brings that saturated section up further, and you have less overall water holding capacity in that pot, in that soil. So that's exactly what you're doing when you put a layer of gravel down when you don't need one. Now, there are two basic regular types of pots you're going to find. There's the standard, which is your regular tall size pot. It's taller than it is wide. And your azalea pot, which is shorter versus being as wide. Let's see the two of them together. Now, there's a reason for having two standard sizes like this. The azalea pots are named azalea pots because they started out and were generally used for growing azaleas, which needed a very well-draining, quick-draining potting soil, so that they were watered regularly, but they didn't want any water staying. So it just had a lot of sand in that, and so it just went through very, very quickly. And they just didn't need and they were very shallow rooted. And so they just didn't need as much potting soil. And commercially, if you're not using as much potting soil, it doesn't cost you as much money when you're going through bales and bales and bales of potting soil. So that's where the azalea pots came from. The standard pots were for everything else. They got deeper roots and they wanted to have more water holding capacity and didn't nearly need to drain quite as fast, just like to stay sort of evenly moist. When you have an azalea pot, that's when you really don't want to be putting that drainage at the bottom of that container. Or if you have a decorative container that is much wider than tall, They make fantastic containers for your annuals, especially something that is 2, 3 times as wide as it's tall. However, you want to make sure that what's holding your moisture is going all the way down to the bottom of that pot. You still want drainage there, so you have to make sure that hole down there is free and clear and fast draining. If it's not, drill some extras in there. You can lay down a piece of coffee filter or landscape fabric to make sure the potting soil doesn't end up plugging up that hole in the bottom. Sounds weird, but it happens. But so you can fill up the majority of your pot with that potting soil, and it will hold as much water to make it last from one day to the next without wilting. If you have a decorative container that is tall and thin and narrow, and you're using this for annuals especially, the roots are never going to go down more than 12 inches or so. Any potting soil you put down below that is just not worth the investment. And so that is a really good time to fill up that extra space with gravel is a good one because it's heavy and can add some extra weight so it's not going to tip as much in the wind. If you're not worried about it tipping, use something inexpensive like used water bottles. Recycle something just to use something to take up that space that's lightweight. Cover it with a landscape fabric and then put your potting soil up above there. Well, I hope that cleared up some of the times when you do want rocks in the bottom of your containers, when you don't, and why sometimes it's okay to use them and sometimes it's better off if you don't. Again, this is Tony at besidethefrontdoor.com, and we'll see you next time.